Robert Fulton, Boy Craftsman, by Marguerite Henry. Chapter 1. Bob and the Gunsmith. Here it was, October, in this year 1773. Yet the noonday sun, beating down on Lancaster, Pennsylvania, was almost as warm as in mid-July. Yet the dry leaves, in shades of red, brown, and yellow, showed that it was fall. 7-year-old Bob Fulton hurried up the runway of the gunsmith shop. Then he stopped short. He liked to see what kind of work was going on before he entered. He looked very small in the wide-open doorway, but he looked determined, too. It was almost as if he were the gunsmith, and this was his shop. He wished it belonged to him. The afternoon would be fun, he thought. The shop was busy. A mare, tied to the hitching post, stamped and pawed the ground as she waited her turn. Inside, a peddler of tinware snored in the chair by the door. His little stocks of pans and kettles was heaped in front of him. The ox cage was occupied too. It held a huge brown and white ox. He was strapped into a sling which hung down from the ceiling. The creature looked worried and uncomfortable. He seemed to know that soon he would be hoisted into the air. Funny, Bob thought, that an ox can't stand on 3 feet while the 4th is being shod. He was glad that he was not so heavy as an ox. It would be clumsy to hang from the rafters while his mothers and sisters put on his shoes. He laughed to himself. Then suddenly he thought of the iron candlestick. Today was his mother's birthday, and he must finish it. He walked quickly to the peg where a small cowhide apron hung. As he slipped it over his head, he noticed that the newness was beginning to wear off. There were actually a few darkish spots of axle grease on it. Soon it would look like the gunsmith's, except for the size. The gunsmith was busy selecting a piece of iron. He had not heard the boy's light footsteps. "I'm here, Mr. Messersmith," Bob shouted. Now the gunsmith turned around. His smile widened until it showed the dark hole where 2 of his back teeth were missing. "So you be," he chuckled, "and just in time. What with bullets to cast and new muskets to make, I need a sharp lad to give me a hand. But Jack in the ox cage and the mare at the hitching post need shoes first." "Yes, sir," replied Bob. "You need a strong boy to pump the bellows. Your fire is not hot enough to get all this work done." Mr. Messersmith laughed, a booming, noisy laugh that seemed part of the forge and the fire. "For a lad of 7, he said, "you have more sense than a dozen full-grown men." Bob flew around to the back of the chimney and built himself a footstool of bricks. Then, standing on the bricks, he reached for the long wooden handle that worked the bellows. Up and down he pumped. There was a great wheezy noise, louder than that made by the snoring peddler. As he pumped, he glanced down at his muscles. Each day he hoped they would swell up big, like the gunsmith's. At times he was sure they were getting bigger. Now he peered around the chimney. Mr. Messersmith seemed pleased. He was lifting the red-hot iron out of the coals, and almost at once came the great ringing sound of the hammer on the anvil. When Bob stepped down off the bricks, he noticed that the dirt floor needed sweeping. Broken nails, scraps of iron, and hoof parings were scattered everywhere. With long strokes of the broom, he kept time to the wonderful music of the anvil. Even when he swept around the ox cage, he did not miss a beat. He loved rhythm. At last the ox shoes were shaped, and the gunsmith was plunging them into the cold water. They made a loud hissing sound. At the exact moment when the hissing began, the peddler jumped into the air. "A snake!" he cried, his eyes bulging with terror, and in his excitement he stumbled over his tinware and sprawled headlong. Johnny cake pans, cookie cutters, dippers, and mugs rattled and rolled to the far corner of the shop. "It's no snake, you hear," roared the gunsmith, slapping his thighs. "It's Jack's shoes hissing." The peddler could take a joke on himself. He laughed until the buttons on his waistcoat rose up and down like ducks riding the waves. Bob, too, was doubled in laughter. It was all he could do to gather up the peddler's stock. Happens you're too busy to give me a hand with Jack? Mr. Messersmith asked Bob with a twinkle in his eye. He knew that this was Bob's favorite task. Quick as a flash, the boy found the last cookie cutter. Then, feeling very important, he took hold of the crank that turned the wheel in the loft. Squeak, squeak, sounded the wheel. Slowly, slowly it turned. The rope was moving, and the great ox in his leather sling was lifted off his tiny feet. Helpless as a kitten, he hung swaying in the air. Not every lad can lift an ox, winked the gunsmith. There's probably not another lad in Lancaster who's as strong as an ox. Bob Fulton stood with his feet braced far apart, his hands on his hips. He felt stronger than an ox. Forging a candlestick. On most days, Bob liked to watch the gunsmith fix ox shoes. 2 tiny shoes to each cloven hoof. But today he had more important business. From the bench by the window he took a bar of iron. It was about a foot long and already resembled a candlestick. One more heating and shaping, and no queen could have a finer gift, nodded Mr. Messersmith. But before candle lighting time, I'm going to need a good supply of nails. Bob tried not to show his disappointment. Anxiously he raised his eyes to the sun. It still rode high in the sky. There might be time to shape the nails and finish the candlestick too. He shoved half a dozen rods in the glowing mouth of the forge. They were no bigger than rats' tails and heated quickly. In just a little while he was beating them out into nails with funny square heads. When he had 100 nails in the keg, he felt the gunsmith's hand on his shoulder. I've set your candlestick in the forge, lad, he said kindly. You've done enough work. Bob's small hands trembled with excitement. He picked up the tongs. Carefully he moved the slender piece of iron into the heart of the fire. Now Mr. Messersmith was actually working the bellows for him. The boy looked up and smiled. The gunsmith smiled back. Bob thought him the handsomest man in the world. Even the dark hole where there should have been teeth looked friendly and interesting. What did it matter if a boy had no father, so long as he had a friend like the gunsmith? I judge the iron to be right, sir, shouted Bob above the noise. The gunsmith stopped pumping the bellows. Bob worked quickly now. He swung the glowing metal to the anvil. With the tongs in his left hand, he kept turning it. All the while, he tapped and shaped it with a light hammer. Pennies from the gunsmith. The sun was low in the heavens when Bob slipped off his leather apron. How wonderfully dirty it looked. There were charcoal smudges all over it. What was more, it bellied out as if he were still inside it. Bob grinned with satisfaction. In no time at all, he would be grown up. It would be fine to earn money. He would buy his mother a farm, and for his sisters, he would choose bonnets and caraway cakes. He might even give little Abraham a coin now and then, although sometimes Abraham could be a nuisance, leaving his chores for Bob to do. The shop was empty now. The peddler and his newly shod ox were gone. Only the gunsmith worked on. It's a pity we've no paper to wrap so fine a candlestick, he said. In the whole colony of Pennsylvania, I've never seen a finer piece. My mother won't mind about the wrapping, sir. But before I go, he added, I've news to tell you. News? Yes, sir. This night my mother gives me my last schooling. Tomorrow I go to Master Caleb Johnson's school. I may be getting late here. This is news indeed, Mr. Messersmith stroked his beard thoughtfully. Then he reached into the pockets under his apron and produced 2 shiny pennies. These are for you, he said proudly. They will buy 1 penny's worth of vermilion coloring and 1 penny's worth of copperas, and you can make red and black ink for school. 2 whole pennies for his own. He put them in the little cup of the candlestick and clamped his hand over them for safekeeping. Oh, thank you, sir. Mother will know how to make the ink. Happens I'd always wanted to letter with blank ink and with red, the gunsmith added. Now I'll enjoy knowing I bought the ink, so you could write like a gentleman. The gunsmith held out his hand. Bob put his little one inside the great horny warmth of the master's. He felt it close around with clasp so strong it made him blink. He had never shaken hands man to man before. His heart grew warm, like the fire when the bellows breathed on it. It was fun to be big.